June 1944, Oahu, territory of Hawaiʻi. The leeward air sits heavy in a narrow gulch near Kunia. Red dirt clings to sweat-dark cloth. Barbed wire makes straight lines where the land wants to curve. In the distance, beyond the fence, cane fields stand in ordered ranks, and somewhere out of sight, a pump hums. Steady, mechanical, indifferent. Inside the stockade, the morning begins the same way it begins on every military post in the American War. A whistle, boots on hard-packed ground, and the smell that arrives before the sun has fully cleared the ridge. Coffee. Not tea, not boiled rice water, not a thin miso made from whatever could be scraped together. Coffee. Dark, bitter, unmistakably real, cut with sugar when the supply allows. And with it, white bread. Soft slices that compress under a thumb and spring back, pale as paper, smelling faintly of yeast and a bakery no prisoner can see. For men who have been taught that surrender is the end of a soldier's name, the first shock is not the fence, it is breakfast. This moment matters because it sits at the intersection of two wartime worlds that rarely touched without violence. The imperial Japanese system that defined capture as disgrace, and the American system that, under law, policy, and the watchful presence of outside inspectors, treated enemy prisoners as a logistical responsibility and a moral statement. In the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a phase of relentless American advance. Island by island, airfield by airfield, the perimeter tightened. Saipan would fall that July. The Philippines were drawing near. Japanese units, cut off from supply, were already fighting with hollow stomachs and eroding hope. Many did not imagine captivity as a place where the enemy would feed them. They imagined it as a final humiliation before death. But the United States, for its part, had entered the war with an institutional framework that had been sharpened by the First World War and codified by international agreement. The 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war required that the food ration of prisoners be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of depot troops of the detaining power, an unromantic line with enormous consequences in daily life behind wire. For Japan, the story of captivity was different. Imperial doctrine, social pressure, and a military code that prized death over surrender meant that many Japanese soldiers carried into combat not only ammunition and rice, but an internal sentence already pronounced: to be captured was to be erased. Allied intelligence and post-war recollections repeatedly encountered this pattern. Prisoners, who initially refused water, who expected execution, who feared kindness as deception. In the Pacific, where atrocities were real and mutual fear was thick, a cup of coffee could look like a trap. What they experienced, in countless cases, was something more complex. Discipline without spectacle, confinement without constant beating, and a daily routine anchored by American logistics. It was not paradise. Stockade life was monotonous, restricted, watched. But it was not the anticipated abyss. It was instead an encounter with a different kind of power, the kind that can afford to keep men alive. The recurring symbol in this story is simple: a tin cup of coffee. It appears again and again because coffee was everywhere in the American war, on ships, in foxholes, in supply trains, in base camps. It was a stimulant, a morale tool, a ritual. American military and civilian life treated coffee as essential enough that shortages on the home front triggered rationing in 1942 and 1943. The National Park Service summarizes that coffee rationing ran from November 1942 into mid-1943, a reminder that even the world's most productive industrial power still managed scarcity through policy. And yet, even with rationing, coffee flowed through the armed forces in volumes that astonished outsiders. It was built into U.S. ration systems and quartermaster planning. Operational rations and garrison feeding doctrine treated coffee and bread as basic components of the American meal. For a Japanese prisoner, the cup's meaning was not culinary. It was ideological. A warm drink, served routinely, inside a fence, by an enemy who had the capacity to land entire divisions across the ocean. This was a kind of proof. Proof that American abundance was not only propaganda. Proof that a system could wage total war and still bake bread. Records and inspections give the scene its factual spine. In the broader American POW system, regulations and international standards shaped daily conditions. VAR, department guidance existed specifically for the custody of POWs in the continental United States, reflecting a bureaucratic approach rather than an improvised one. Source, and within the machinery of oversight, international access mattered. U.S. State Department wartime documents note that Red Cross representatives were allowed to visit camps in the United States and Hawaiʻi, where Japanese nationals were held, and ADTOT. Important contrast with the limited access Allied agencies had inside the Japanese POW system. At Honouliuli itself, the National Park Service emphasizes that POW camps were designed to follow the Geneva Convention and meet basic needs, food included, and that captivity. There encompassed multiple nationalities and categories of detainees. There is also a trail of first-hand memory around Honouliuli and related Hawaiʻi detention sites, preserved through community archives. The Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaiʻi hosts excerpts from confidential stories at Honouliuli, describing the monotony and controlled routines of life under confinement accounts that place coffee not as a metaphor, but as a literal part of the camp's daily texture. And beyond Hawaiʻi, scholarship and compiled histories document how the experience of Japanese POWs in America repeatedly collided with expectation. The Pacific Historical Review article, Japanese Prisoners of War in America, is one academic entry point into that world, referencing inspections and camp visits as part of the evidentiary record. But a documentary script lives not only on citations, it lives on contrast, on what a man believed yesterday and what his senses are forced to accept today. Imagine the Japanese soldier arriving not as a name, but as a condition. Weeks of hunger, skin tight around the cheekbone, a uniform stiff with dried salt and mud, the memory of bombardment still ringing in the skull like a struck bell. For many, capture followed collapse, a position overrun, a cave sealed, a wounded body unable to move with the retreat. Some came in groups, others came alone, out of foliage, hands raised, eyes fixed on rifles and bayonets. Even in surrender, they watched for the final blow. Then the stockade, the geometry of American war, wire, posts, guard towers, a gate that opens and closes on schedule, a registration process, a search, delousing, medical inspection. No drama, only procedure. In that very lack of drama, the first fracture begins. The enemy does not need to shout. The enemy is organized enough to be quiet. And then the mess line. The bread is not a delicacy in American terms. It is ordinary. So ordinary it can be stacked, counted, issued. It is white because American milling and enrichment, policies and industrial baking made white flour a mass product long before the war. It is soft because American bakeries can spare yeast and fuel. It is sliced because machines can slice it. To a prisoner raised on rice as the central measure of a meal, bread is an alien staple, wheat made into softness. It is filling in a different way, swelling in the stomach, making hunger feel temporarily distant. The coffee arrives hot. That heat is its own message. On half-starved islands, fuel is precious. Heat is rare. Hot drinks are luxuries. Here, behind wire, heat is routine. Coffee is brewed at scale, poured, refilled. Sometimes it is strong, sometimes thin, sometimes sweetened, sometimes not. But it is there, day after day. What did they expect? Many expected that the enemy would mirror the harshness they had been taught to admire. They expected punishment for the shame of surrender. They expected a cage where hunger would be prolonged and humiliation would be the lesson. What did they experience? They experienced that the Americans, bound to policy and watched by inspectors, often fed prisoners at a level that surprised them. They encountered a system that, in many camps, aligned POW rations with those of American troops in garrison, reflecting both Geneva requirements and the simple logistical truth that the United States could afford it. The Geneva Convention, language about equivalent rations, was not poetic. It was operational. There were, of course, darker edges: violence at capture, harsh conditions in forward areas, racism and resentment within the U.S. armed forces and among civilians, and the broader contradiction of America fighting for freedom while maintaining segregation and, at the same time, incarcerating Japanese Americans. But within the fenced routine of many POW sites, the daily reality of food and basic medical care created its own quiet revolution in perception. The transformation in this story is not sentimental. It is not instant. It is not universal. But it is real in the way that sustained routine can be real. A worldview does not collapse in one morning. It erodes when the evidence keeps repeating. Day 1, the prisoner suspects poison. Day 3, he notices the guard drinks the same coffee. Day 7, he understands the bread is not bait. It is standard. Day 14, he realizes the camp is not improvising. It is supplied. Day 30, he has gained weight. Day 60, he begins to think in a way he has not permitted himself to think since the war began. If the enemy can feed him, perhaps the enemy is not the caricature he carried across the ocean. Coffee, in this sense, becomes a metronome for ideological time. It marks mornings. It marks survival. It becomes the sensory proof of a state with deep supply lines, ships, warehouses, procurement contracts, farms, mills, roasters, quartermaster depots. The cup holds not only a beverage, but an entire industrial society reduced to something a trembling hand can lift. Even the setting reinforces the symbolism. Honouliuli was known to many incarcerated there by a darker nickname, Hell Valley, a phrase that captures heat, dust, confinement, and isolation. The cruelty was not necessarily in the ration, but in the loss of freedom, in the gulch's oppressive atmosphere, in the knowledge that the world continued beyond the fence. Yet inside that Hell Valley, the presence of white bread and coffee created a contradiction too sharp to ignore. Hell, with a bakery schedule. If you listen closely to the soundscape of such a camp, you can hear why this story fits the WWII Tales documentary rhythm. The barbed wire does not speak. The guards do not need to. The evidence arrives in repetition. Ladles against metal, boots at inspection, the low murmur of a camp waking, and always the thin slosh of coffee poured into cups. Historical evidence also lives in the fact that these systems were inspected, reported, and argued over. International access to camps in the United States and Hawaii created a paper trail, visits, summaries, observations, part of the diplomatic record of a war fought not only with torpedoes and bombers, but with claims about civilization itself. For the prisoner, that sameness can be unsettling. In the Imperial Japanese system, hierarchy was everything: rank, class, obedience, shame. In an American camp, the hierarchy exists. Officers and enlisted are separated, according to convention, but the food itself can feel strangely leveling. A slice of bread does not ask a man's pedigree before it fills his stomach. And so the transformation continues, not from hatred to love, but from certainty to doubt. Doubt is historically significant, because it is the beginning of an inner war that outlasts the outer one. A prisoner who doubts the propaganda he carried may begin to doubt the ideology that demanded his death. A prisoner who survives in captivity may return home to a society that must decide what to do with survivors of surrender, men who have seen that the enemy's abundance was real. In the epilogue of such a story, the camera of narration pulls back from the gulch. The Pacific remains enormous. The war remains brutal. Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, names that will be written with smoke. The stockade is only a footnote in tonnage and casualty lists, and yet history is often altered not only by battles, but by quiet evidence. A tin cup of coffee does not stop a war. White bread does not undo imperial doctrine. But for a captured soldier sitting behind wire in a Hawaiian gulch, the taste of coffee can be the first honest thing he has been offered in years. A fact. That fact is simple. The enemy can feed him. And in wartime, when nations compete to define whose system deserves to survive, that fact becomes a kind of argument without words. An argument brewed each morning, poured into identical cups, and carried across a fence in silence. Freedom, in the end, is not only the absence of offense. It is the presence of a society capable of sustaining life at scale, capable of producing more than it consumes, capable of feeding even those who came to destroy it, capable of binding its power to rules that outsiders can inspect and record. That is not a claim of moral perfection. It is a statement about capacity and about the strange ways capacity becomes belief. In June 1944, in a stockade on Oahu, a Japanese prisoner lifts a tin cup. The coffee is bitter. The bread is soft. The wire is real. The war is not over, but something else has begun. The slow, irreversible realization that abundance can be a weapon, and restraint can be a language, and that ideologies, like bodies, change when they are forced to eat the truth.